So today, the two books in question, I guess you've seen the covers. So Lexington and Horse. So two books that I really quite enjoyed. I read Horse first, so I will talk about it first, but there's also a reason why I'm going to talk about it first because it kind of goes with my pattern in the past of reading a book that is fiction but heavily inspired by reality, and then having a lot of fun going and finding if that information was actually factual. So I'm very lucky that basically these two books are there because I can literally just then go to this one to check how factual this one was. I mean, it doesn't take anything away from the fictional book, but it's kind of nice to be able to do that. I remember the first time I did that, I was in high school and I read a book that was called Byzantium. And it was about this marvelous journey of a monk going from Ireland and all the way to Byzantium, which is Constantinople. And then after reading it, I was so enamored by the whole world and what was it like at that time. And he had traveled with Vikings. I spent like hours in the libraries researching how factual it had been. So anyway, so it was a little bit of that, sorry, in the case of reading Horse. So the books are both about Lexington. So that's the fun part here, is discovering this horse, this amazing horse. So he was born in 1850 and he died in 1875. So 25 years basically to his whole life. So a long life for a horse, and by all indication, died very healthy and very sound. Which, when we're going to discuss what he was doing and the type of care he had, is a little bit surprising. So the more I read about him, of course, I knew nothing about him when I read the books. What I can kind of draw a parallel here is that he is the northern dancer of his time. So bay horse, some white, diminutive in size, although at the time he wasn't seen as small, but it would look like he was about 15'3", so not quite 16 hands, so not a giant by any mean. Um, and he had a huge influence on the thoroughbred racing. So it's kind of interesting to do a bit of a parallel. They were both owned by a very rich individual. That is not a surprise, obviously, in the world of thoroughbred. Who has the money to own these animals? Obviously, wealthy people. So a lot of parallel there, except that, of course, Northern Dancer is very close to us. So we have a lot of pictures and information, and he lives in the people's imagination, where Lexington was basically forgotten because he is from deep time, like the equivalent of deep time, like 1850 and 1860. I mean, you got to really reach way back to imagine what was the world like at that time? What was the US like at that time? And so this book really provided an interesting perspective on the historical aspect, but of course, making us discover the horse. So these two books were published within a year of each other. So Horse came out first in 2022, followed by Lexington in 2023. The author must have crossed paths, if, they must have been looking at the same material, because they both did quite a bit of research, obviously, in order to be able to get to write these books. So I can't help but to think that they must have crossed paths at some point. And in fact, on the top of the cover of Lexington is a quote here by the author of Horse, Geraldine Brooks, that says, a fascinating account from start to finish. Well, I bet she found it interesting because it was the same material she had searched for her books. All right, so Geraldine Brooks. Absolutely great author. She has published many books. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner for her book called March. She's originally from Australia, but she became an American citizen later on. She has published many books. Most of them are historically based fiction books, so this is very much in her wheelhouse. And from an interview with her, she was fascinated by the story of the skeleton of Lexington, something we'll get back to a little bit later. And it kind of piqued her interest. And she was like, why have I never heard of this horse? She has an interest in animals, and she started digging into it, and she did all that research and published this book. So this one has, it's structured in an interesting way. It has multiple point of views. So it takes you from the perspective of one person to another. So every chapter, you change the perspective, right? You change the point of view. So if you're not used to that, or if that is a problem, you might not enjoy that book as much. But what it does is that it there's a thread that brings all these stories together, and that is the painting of Lexington, the horse. So an oil painting that was done in toward, I think it was the late 1870s, so closer to his death than his youth. But still, the point is that there's a painting that connects. That's the thread all throughout the book. So we have the perspective of Jess. Jess is an Australian woman that lives and works at the Smithsonian, and she has an interest in mammals and skeleton, and she gets a request at some point for somebody that wants to go look at a particular skeleton of a horse that is tucked away in an attic somewhere. So that's our first connection. She then meets Theo. Theo is studying art, and he wants to write a thesis. And by some luck, he comes across this interesting painting, the painting in question of Lexington, and he starts to look into the story. Theo is a Black man. Jess is a white woman from Australia, as I said. Then the other main character is Jarrett, which is a fictional character, which is kind of an amalgamation of the grooms that were taking care of the race horses at the time of Lexington. He's a Black slave. He was born into slavery, and he is attached to this horse throughout the whole story. And then we also have the perspective of Thomas J. Scott, who is the painter of Lexington. So there is no picture in this particular book, but there's a good description of the oil paintings. And I was very curious. Of course, one of the first thing I did was like, well, describing all these oil painting, I went and I looked at them, and I was not able to find the oil painting in question. And the reason for that, and the mystery of the book, is that it does vanish. We don't know where it is. We know it was painted, but it kind of vanished at some point. Anyway, and finally, Martha Jackson, which is the kind of an art dealer that kind of moves the painting around until it disappears. So those are the multiple point of view that we get. And of course, we're bouncing across time here. With Jarrett, we are with Lexington. We are getting his perspective on the horse, the care of the horse, and the whole environment, but very much from the perspective of the slave and his perception of the owners, which are the very wealthy individual that are pulling all the strings. And then, of course, Jess is more modern times, so we get to see her perspective on this whole story too. So that was interesting. So between the two books, I guess the book from Geraldine Brooks, Horse, is really how does this whole story tie together around this painting of the horse, whereas the thread, the Lexington, which is really a historical fiction one, is more about who was Lexington, what was his time like, and why is he so important? So different perspective, obviously, on these two books. Okay, so what do we have in terms of focus for this particular book? So very heavily focused on the treatment of Black people, but she draws a parallel between Black people and horses in the sense that not considered important at the time and eventually discarded. And we have kind of a parallel with that story with Lexington, the horse himself, because even though he was the absolute horse of his generation, over time, completely forgotten. We have his skeleton that are mounted and then relinquished to an attic somewhere, stripped of any information. The label for the skeleton is just horse, meaning not even given its name, right? It took a lot of time for that skeleton to come out of the closet. I shouldn't say that, come out of the attic and be given the respect and the admiration that really it should have had. It has moved now from the attic of the Smithsonian. It is now at the Lexington, the Kentucky Museum of the Horse. I found that out in this book, did not from this one. So it is a fiction book. So what did I like? Well, I really like the connection to the horse. I mean, we follow Jarrett, and so we really get to see how that particular horse was. She gives it the personality. She gives him all the attribute that she could find, and we see him through the eyes of Jarrett, which is his groom that is very invested in his well-being. He is there at the birth and all the way through all of his life. Unfortunately, that ended up being fictional in the sense that there was a groom named Jarrett, but he was not able to follow the horse all the way through his life. But anyway, this is a fiction book, so we'll take it for that. I like the mystery because when you start reading that book and you see all these various threads all over, you're like, how is this connecting? And it keeps you reading because you're a little bit interested from why are we talking about, okay, well, why we're talking about Jared, because he's in contact with the horse, but what does Theo have to do with anything? And where is that painting? And how did he get there? So that part was interesting. I quite like the science. Also, they delve at some point into the details of how skeletons are prepared to be mounted. I thought it was quite interesting to understand the technique of how that is done. I had no idea. And the descriptions are quite good. I mean, she's a well-established author, obviously, so she knows her craft very well. So I was particularly taken with the description of the birth of the foal that became Lexington, because, of course, having been there for the birth of so many horses, I can tell you that this is well described. So I'll read you just a little section here. He came awake to the splash of the mare's water breaking. She had a low groan and folded herself gently into the bedding hay. Harry knelt beside her as the birth sack bulged. The tiny crescent of the hooves were clearly visible through the pearly membrane, folded daintily one on top the other, sole down in the correct position for an uncomplicated birth. Sure enough, when the foreleg were almost to the knee, a slick, wet muzzle followed, the foal in perfect position. As a breeder, that's when you go, oh, good, this is perfect. Here's the hard part, murmured Harry. The shoulder, the widest part of the foal. He hummed on, encouraging Alice, that was the name of the mare. He could see the little white hooves straining at the membrane of the birth sac, and minutes later, the sac split and the foal sluiced forward. Sluiced, like with water. A tiny horse slipped out onto the hay like a gift from a package. Very accurate. Having seen so many births, when everything goes well, it's exactly what it looks like. And so very well described. So she knows how to write. She knows how to build a scene. She knows how to put you in the mind of the character. So very good. What I did not like about the book, frankly, I didn't like all the characters. I suppose you don't have to like them all. Some of them were in their personality, I suppose, a little bit annoying. Particularly, I'm thinking of Thomas J. Scott, the painter. He struck me as a little bit of always complaining, and it was told from his perspective, and he was actually a little bit tossed around by history. He trained as a physician, but then he decided that he wanted to paint horse, and then he became the student of a very, very famous horse painter. So he was in his shadow for a bit, and he tried to do it on his own, and people were not giving much respect. And then the Civil War happened. So the Civil War in America was in between 1861 to 1865. So Lexington, during his stud year, is right in the thick of it. And so we get that history in there. And interestingly enough, it turned out that between the Battle of the South and the North, Kentucky tried to stay neutral, interesting enough, trying not to get involved in both of them. But of course, war came to them anyway. So a little bit of history in there, a heck of a lot more of history in this book. But I'm finishing about the horse. And of course, this painter, Thomas J. Scott, joined the army, and then there's all the hardship that comes from being in the army at that time, of course. So it was a little bit embellished and simplified for good reason. We're trying to tell a story here. So there were some aspect of it that I thought, knowing horses, I'm not sure that is really realistic, of how they moved at night. At some point, there's an escape during the night, and Jared collects some horses with the help of Lexington, who at that time is mostly blind. And I'm thinking, it's a little bit hard to believe that it would have been that easy. But again, I don't live at those times. And in those times, the horses were so much more integrated into people's life. They rode them everywhere. Maybe they were a bit easier to deal with than my crew, for sure. So that's the book. So if yes, you have somebody that loves horses, that has an interest in history, but also wants a good bit of a mystery, not so much mystery, but more like following that thread, and would prefer a fiction book, absolutely. So now you know what I think of this one. On to this other one, Lexington, the actual historical story of Lexington. So the author in this case, this is her first book. So the author, Kim Wickens, is originally a defense attorney from Texas. And then I don't know what happens, but she decides that she wants to write. She takes some lessons, some courses on writing, and this is her first book. She becomes fascinated with Lexington. I wonder if it happened before or after she moved to Lexington, the city, because that is where she lives now, in Kentucky. The name of the city is not a coincidence. Lexington was originally called Darley, and his name was changed when he was bought to participate in a race in which they were represented, a horse representing every state. And so he was bought because he was born in Kentucky and he was meant to represent Kentucky. And they thought, well, we can't call him Darley. We got to find a name that's fitting for his role in this particular race. And so he got the name Lexington, of course, and that's the name we know him by now. So she wrote this book. Great research. Like, obviously, she also did tons of research, but a much broader perspective. She's not interested in the individual people in as much as they reflect what was going on at the time and the way that they touch Lexington in one way or another. So a much bigger ensemble to follow, basically. The book is split into 3 parts. The first part is the horse and in his era. And it's over the story of Lexington as we know it from this book, in terms of his birth, his training, his triumph on the track, and then his retirement at stud. It's basically, in this book, it's over by page 143. But a lot more information to come after that. The second part, the second part of the book is the development of the thoroughbred in North America. So obviously imported stock from Great Britain, where they continue to breed, but also the stock comes to the US and then develops separately. So one thing that they did differently is that while originally the horses in Great Britain were raced over very long distances compared to what we have today, they kind of let that go earlier than in the US. In the US, at the time of Lexington, horses are still being run over 4 miles. 4 miles. That's like 6.5 kilometers for one race. And they don't only race once during the day. If the race is close, they run a second race in the same day. There's 45 minutes where they get to be cooled down and massaged and basically catch their breath, and then they do it again. So a horse could run 8 miles in one day. And the condition of the ground, obviously, they didn't have the grooming machine that we have now. So you can imagine them running through either rock hard track or in one case, very well described in this book, absolute slop, meaning there had been a lot of rain, and supposedly the horses were up to mid cannon in mud as they raced for 8 miles, for like unbelievable, the endurance of these horses. And so, because of that, it really required a different kind of horse. They called them horse with bottom, horses with stamina. You can really see or infer the influence of the Arabian in these horses that are able to run for long distance, right? So that was fascinating, not only to read about how long these races were, but how they prepared, conditioned the horses for them, how they cared for the horse in between the race. We're talking here, they didn't have liniment, so they rubbed alcohol on their muscles to keep them soft. And the alcohol they had on hand was whiskey. So they were literally rubbed and massaged with whiskey to keep everything as warm as possible. And of course, they would weight them down depending on age. So that was the way that they handicapped them with weight. Older horses having more weight than younger one. Males racing against females. So we had fillies and mares racing against stallions and geldings. They was obviously racing all kinds. So that was interesting. So really very different than what we know today, but the origin of it. And the part two goes into how people went to England and brought back some stallions in order to diversify the gene pool, and who ended up buying Lexington at an incredible price at the time because he was the horse of his generation, and how he managed to build the pedigree and the influence that it has today now on the horses. We don't know about Lexington because he is so far back in the pedigree, but if you do trace him back, he ends up showing up in of course, the majority of the winners, the big winners on the racetrack in North America, because obviously that is where the stock came from. So, a really interesting part. In part two, however, I have to say that she goes into the history of the Civil War really in depth. And there was some part that I did not enjoy because I didn't see the connection. And it was, she spent, I think, two full chapter describing some gang that was roaming Kentucky and looting and things like that. I understand it builds the story of the condition that the horses were in. I didn't get much out of it, as much as I like history. That part didn't interest me as much. I was surprised, however, to learn. I don't know much about American history these days. I am learning way more about history because I follow Heather Cox Richardson. She has a historical perspective of what's going on politically in the United States, and I find her very interesting. So I'm learning a little bit more, but obviously I'm a Canadian. I didn't learn American history, so this was new. But this idea that during the Civil War, it became really quite lawless, and between all the armies being working and fighting each other, in the vacuum, there was a lot of gangs and looting, and literally they came to these big farms looking for horses, and they would just take them at gunpoint. And you could have built like a whole stable of the best thoroughbred. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted horses that were fast. They wanted horses that were healthy, that were wet kept, to replace their horses. So they would come in, they would shoot, they would take the horses, and you lost everything, right? So in that context, that touches Lexington at some part, because the farm where he is looted at some point by some of these gangs. So that's an interesting perspective. I mean, we haven't lived through war here in Canada and in the US. It's been a while, but this lawlessness is very scary, and nobody was exempt from it. So what did I really like about this book? A more complete context for where Lexington was born and how he was raised and why he was so important in his time. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you everything. You should read the book. It also talks about his progeny, so that was interesting. His descendant. He was so prepotent and so favored by the breeders because he brought so much quality to his offspring that he was very much in demand. And I think for 16 years he was the top sire in the United States. Of course, at the time there was not the same number of horses that there is now, of course, but still 16 years running. People would go to him to get some racehorse offspring. Um, Accurate racing. So I think she really went into the detail. And when she is not able to find when there's some conflicting information, because she's taking the information about the races and the times from obviously newspaper that were printed at the time. So when there's a contradiction, she brings it up. So she's very transparent here, but very accurate racing information on the day, the weather, the condition of the track, which horses were facing which one was the favorite, a bit of the breeding behind them. So if you like that type of stuff, she really goes in detail. So that's quite good. It's very complete, and it has pictures. So there's actually one picture of Lexington taken 3 years before he died. So we're looking at 1872. So a very old picture, but we still get to see what he looked like in the flesh, because the painting of him. So he was painted many times, and not just by this character that we get to meet in Horse called Thomas J. Scott, but he was also painted by the top livestock painters of the day. With no photography, of course, painting was quite important. And I'm going to see if I can share that, because I have a portrait of Lexington. It's not the one that's on the book. This one was done by Thomas J. Scott. It was done by Keon. But let's see if I can share my screen. Yes, it's this one. So this is a painting by the portrait of Lexington. So I hope you can see this. This is what the painting looked like. So you look at that today and you're like, okay, trying to understand the horse, supposedly very accurate. He was described, I will read you the description of Lexington here. He grew into form as splendid as Boston. So Boston was his sire, a very impressive horse in his own right. Standing 15 hand 3 inches, a good height for that era, Darley, as he was called originally, was born with the build of a runner. His bones were slender, except his backbone, which was unusually large due to his wide chest. Okay, so it took me a while to understand what she meant by backbone and why it was wide. The way I understand it, he was broad, meaning his back was broader and he had a big chest. And some people have speculated that it helped him breathe better. But anyway, she goes on and explains that. Which was unusually large due to his wide chest, a genetic formation inherited from Boston, his sire. Where other horses outweighed Darley by 200 pounds, he made up for that heft in muscular build. So we can clearly see in the picture here in the painting, that he is quite muscular. His large nostril and wide jawbone, so wide that one man compared him to a squirrel with cheek full of acorn. So that's a characteristic of a lot of stallions, to have big jowl, but it would seem that in his case, they were even wider apart than others. And a deep chest combined gave him an exceptional ability to breathe. Like Alice Carneal's, his dam, Darley's shoulders were slanted, wide, and strong, enabling the colt a greater reach with his foreleg and a longer stride. The enormous size of his rib cage made his front leg appear shorter than they were. People talk a lot about his pastern. His pastern connecting his hoof to his fetlock were long, slightly upright, and firm, springing each of his step and giving him excellent flexibility. So it would seem that he had slightly upright pastern, something that's interesting, but it was seen as a quality. So interesting to see that. So here that's the painting, and we have the description here. It talks about the fact that Thomas J. Scott, that we follow in him, in here. Um, yeah, and interestingly, it's from the Martha Jackson Memorial Collection, and Martha Jackson is also a character in this one in relation to the painting. So it all ties together. Always, always good with historical fiction to have all that back to that. Okay, so now I can stop sharing. So, yeah, very well detailed. So I really like that about the book. It's more complete, it's more accurate. And so, what did I not like? So, I've already mentioned the Civil War bit, literally two chapter going on and on about the outlaw and what they stole and how they behave and how they were caught and how they were eventually hung. Eh, that was not about the horse. So personally, I didn't care. I was like, why are we going down that rabbit hole? I'm not sure why. Um, because they have some contact with Lexington, but very briefly, they go to the farm, they loot the farm, but they don't get Lexington. They get his son, who at the time was the horse of the time. He was called Asteroid. They steal him. There's a whole pursuit about getting him back. And that part was fascinating, how these horses, they were not just running a lot on the racetrack. These horses were asked to do everything, and even in order to go to a race, there was no horse trailer. They had to walk there. So sometime they had to walk for a couple of days to get to the racetrack. They would get time to rest, and then they would be prepped for the race. And then when they had to move across wide distances, they had to get on ship, like on a boat down the Mississippi, in condition that if you have horses would make your hair stand on end. And yet these horses were lifted up by a crane with a sling underneath, put on the deck, and then squeezed into a stall in which they had to brace for a trip that often took 2 weeks. They were so worn out by the time they got to their destination. They were generally given a couple of months to recuperate so that they could race. So, really interesting to read about that. So, that part was great. Um, the other part that I didn't quite enjoy as much is when we get to the story of how the bones were kept by the Smithsonian for the longest time. It goes on for pages and pages, in which the Kentucky Horse Association claims they want the bones to be taken out and put in a museum, and Smithsonian go and says no. Anyway, it obviously takes years and years, but eventually they relent, and you can now see the Lexington skeleton in there. All right, so I don't want to give too much detail because I still think that it's definitely worth reading if you're interested in it. Yeah, so just catching up on the chat here now that I've read all my notes. So if you have questions, now's the time. So hello from Montana, hello from Brooklyn, somebody from Texas, awesome. So the author is originally from Texas. How does this book compare with other fictional book? Like I read Seabiscuit, right? So the story of Seabiscuit was also really interesting and a very good book, and also a very good movie that they made out of it. Um, this this is interesting because Lexington was on the east part of North America, where Seabiscuit was from California, and of course a little bit later on in time. So there's a whole different context to it. But they both are really good book to understand horse racing at the time, and the popularity of horse racing. It was the sport at the time, right? We don't have football, we don't have basketball, we don't have organized team sport at the time. Horse racing draws thousands, and people make fortune on building race courses. So understanding all that context is really quite interesting. Um, and the detail that she goes into how these horses were taken care of is really interesting. So anyway, so definitely value in understanding the context. And I mean, the title itself, let's be honest, it says The Extraordinary Life and Turbulent Times of America's Legendary Racehorse. And so she's very upfront. This is not just about the horse, it's the horse within its context. And that's the quality of it. All right, so I have somebody here that says that they are starting to read the book. So Chris Wood, you're starting to read the book. You're enjoying it. Yes, mind-boggling on how they move the horses around, right? I agree. Me too. I was like, I don't think my horse would survive a trip down the Mississippi, to be honest, the way that it was arranged. And how, yeah, they walked them everywhere. There was no choice. And who walked them? Well, that's where this one pays a bit closer attention to the treatment of the slaves, the people that were constantly with the horses and what their life was like. They were the one walking the horses from A to B and getting them ready, and of course their health and their condition was very much their responsibility. And if anything happened, they were going to be held accountable. They also were the riders. And the poor jockeys, I mean, if you certainly, if you've read the book Seabiscuit, you know that even many, many years later, the jockeys are really not well treated. Well, in the earlier days, they were not much better. And running a horse at full speed, a thoroughbred that can literally pull your arms out of your socket for 4 miles, and steering it and trying to manage its pace, it was absolutely exhausting. And sometimes they had to change jockey between one heat and the other, so that tells you the level of exhaustion they were in. And in some case, one of the jockeys declined and he walked away, and so the one that had raced the first race, who was already clearly exhausted, had to get on. And and he was pretty tired, but he had to go and race that horse a second time. um some details that were interesting. At one point, Lexington needed to beat the time. So that was interesting. He had to race to prove how fast he was over 4 miles, but they found there was no horses that would compete with him. And so he was he was set, and it was an event, and people made money out of that event, but it was, can he beat the time? And so he was forced to race on his own. But of course, a horse doesn't race very well on their own. So there was a couple of horses that were brought in to basically lure him. And these horses would change, but Lexington would keep running. And he lowered he lowered the tracker, not the track, it was the country's record at the time. So that's an interesting story to read it. It is told in the book. It's modified a little bit. This is the actual account with with a lot of detail. So that's it. That's all I wanted to cover. There's similarity where they merge in terms of, I find it really interesting that these two books were written and published within a year of each other, after this horse having been literally forgotten for, yeah, a long time. Unless you were an absolute aficionado of thoroughbred and history, you didn't know about Lexington. And now he has two books that are both very well received, both worth a read. And yeah, so I definitely recommend it. Now that you have both, you can maybe purchase them, or for yourself or somebody that likes these type of books. And that's it. I'm going to stop here. If there's any questions or anything, put them in the chat. But other than that, the link, if you want to buy the books, obviously, if you want to purchase them for somebody else, the link down in the description are affiliate link. It gives me a small percentage of the cost. No, sorry, of the price. But of course, I also encourage you to go to small bookstores and purchase them there. They probably need the help more than I do. But anyway, so thank you for being here, and I hope this was useful. I'm going to sign off at this point. Thank you for being here, and I might do another one before Christmas. I have a couple of other books that I'd like to discuss, but if not, or if you can't join me at that point, I wish you a Merry Christmas and nice season. And New Year is full of exciting stuff here at the channel. So looking forward to that too. All right. Bye.